좋은 포럼 이제 제가 오전에 한번 언급을 해드렸는데요. 저희가 이 스케줄상에 좀 변화가 있었습니다. 오전에 첫 번째 기조 연사로 오시기로 했던 세네 교수님께서 건강이 좀 좋지 않아서 한국에 입국을 못하셨습니다. 그래서 사실상 저희가 오후에 이 스카이프로 영상을 시도를 해보려고 했는데 영상이 다행히 잘 연결됐다는 소식이 들어왔고요. 그리고 이 시간표상으로 보시면 지금 이 기획 세션 이후에 사센 교수님의 기조 강연이 준비되어 있는데요. 사센 교수님과 세네 교수님은 서로 부부 사이라고 합니다. 그래서 건강이 좋지 않아서 좀 늦게 비행기를 타셨고요. 조금 늦게 오늘 도착하신다고 해서요. 오늘 이사네 교수님의 강연은 내일 준비된 강연에는 함께 하실 수가 있겠고 오늘 강연은 부득이하게 취소가 됨을 여러분께 알려드리겠습니다. 자, 그럼 첫 번째 기조 연설을 해주시기로 약속을 하셨던 그리고 영국에 계시는 세네 교수님을 한번 스카이프로 연결을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 스카이프로 지금 다 보고 계시니까요. 연결이 되면 여러분 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. So Professor Sennett, are you there? 네, 긴장이 되는 순간. Can you hear me? 여러분 박수로 환영해 주시죠. So, how are you feeling today? How are you feeling today?
Well, I'm fine. I'm very sorry that I can't join you all. I'm in hospital, and so I'm going to talk to you briefly about the relationship between cities and climate change today in a global perspective. I should say that this is a subject that I am pursuing as a special advisor to the United Nations on the relation between cities and climate change. But I'm speaking to you personally about this. These are my own views. They don't represent those of the United Nations. And I thought I would talk to you about three things that put together the relationship between cities and climate change. And these are they are social and political problems that emerge in the attempt to practice a sustainable climate strategy. They are problems for which, in some ways, we are taking clues from South Korea, which has had an admirable climate strategy, and in other ways has shown us the possibility of some errors in pursuing a sustainable agenda for urbanism. So I hope you will indulge me as a friendly voice, both admiring and critical of the efforts of South Korea to deal with climate change. So the first thing I want to say to you about this relation between cities and climate change that is a problem has to do with the question of migration. We are expecting in the next 20 years that as the problems of climate change become greater, particularly the problems of lack of water and of rising temperatures, that there will be a massive displacement of people from rural areas into cities. And the question is how to treat them. I give you an example of this from Africa, although this is a problem in Asia as well, in the Asian subcontinent. In Africa, around the edges of the Sahara, the problem of lack of water is what's called sécheresse. I don't know how you translate that in Korean. Is rapidly expanding. And the cities on the edge of the Sahara are themselves losing their water tables, which are drying up. This means that many people are in Africa going to become are going to be climate migrants, and the places where they will go are likely to be in Europe rather than farther south in Africa. To give you an idea of the scale of this politically, when we had in Europe in 2015 about 1,700,000 refugees from the Middle East, the effect of that was absolutely traumatizing on the politics of many European countries, including that of Germany, Greece, Italy, and to some extent Spain. It was a great trauma. It moved people far to the right, fear of foreigners, and so on. That was 1.5 million people. Our expectation is that there will be between 40 and 65 million climate migrants who attempt to come into Europe in the next 2 decades. So you can see this is a huge, looming crisis. For us, part of the problem within the United Nations is we have very limited resources, but the resources we have are confined to people who are classed as refugees rather than migrants. And in the legal language of the the Refugee Act, which governs the United Nations, a refugee who has access to our resources must be someone who is in fear of persecution were he or she to return to their home country. Now, climate change doesn't fit that model. That was a model made at the end of the Second World War to deal with displaced persons throughout Europe and also in Asia. So one of the problems that we are facing is how to rewrite the law so that people who are displaced and have the alternative between dying of thirst and migrating have some rights as migratory citizens. As I say, we have studied this most in Africa, but I believe that you will have some of the same problem. You already have the problem of sécheresse, of desertification, as it's called sometimes, in a lack of water in the subcontinents, Indian subcontinent. And I believe that this is going to be a problem in parts of China as well, which will inevitably affect you. So that's the first issue we're trying to address. We have no solutions for this. These are not solutions. This is not a problem, this mass migration, for which a simple rewrite in the law will make it possible for cities to accommodate this huge wave of incomers. It will require political, social, and economic resources as well coming from cities. The other issue that has to do with migration is that the cities themselves, as the climate heats up, are going to have to reform themselves so that you have a lot of internal movement within cities, away from, for instance, the edges of, in coastal cities, away from the edges of the coast, a movement inward, inland, and upland in order to seek relief from the heat. This is not something that should cause panic, but this kind of internal reorganization of cities is something that has to be taken on board now and planned for, rather than simply have people make erratic moves within cities themselves. So that is the issue of migration and its pressures on cities. The second thing I would like to just mention to you is a problem of democracy. Can we practice climate change democratically? And here I talk to you a little about my own experience. I have worked throughout the world over the course of my life with local communities that want, within the context of cities, to practice communal democracy, as we say in English, from the bottom up. And the problem with climate change is that it may not allow us to deal with the problem of climate democratically. And this is for two reasons. The first is a matter of time. Climate change is like a ticking time bomb. We have about 12, at the most generous measure, about 18 years to prevent the world from a general 2 centigrade rise in climate, beyond which things will be out of our control. So that's a short amount of time. But local democracy is something that is very slow. It requires to build up a consensus in a community, particularly in poor communities, where people are often not connected to their neighbors, where it requires a great deal of effort, which does not yield immediate results. When I worked in Beirut, for instance, to build up a program of local democracy, it took about 3.5 years after the end of the Civil War. So there's a conflict in terms of the time pressure which this global climate change poses, and the time that is needed to practice local democracy from the bottom up. The second issue in democratic practice is that the results of bottom-up communal local democracy vary from community to community. In technical terms, we produce asymmetrical results when we have practiced urban democracy from the bottom up. One community arrives at a solution which is very different than another. And that is a problem because climate change is something that requires a more coordinated and uniform effort to be dealt with. For instance, in the allocation of electricity on an electricity grid, as in New York or in cities in India, there is no way in which the city at peak times can be governed by idiosyncratic decisions made by one community or another, whether they have more electricity or less. Now, I am a believer in local democracy I have spent my life trying to help communities become more democratic and to become more powerful. But I recognize that this problem is a problem which may have arrived at the limits of what democracy can do. This problem of climate change may mean that we have arrived at the limits of a certain political ideal. The third thing I'd like to talk to you about, which is more particular to efforts of planners, is the relationship between mitigation and adaptation in cities. In general, mitigation is an effort to reduce the impact of climate change itself by building seawalls, for instance, or cutting the number of cars on the road. Whereas adaptation is a more behavioral and individualized process of dealing with the consequences of climate change rather than diminishing them. I'll give you an example of this in New York City. After Hurricane Sandy struck, there were proposals to build an enormous seawall around the south tip of Manhattan, which would have mitigated the force of the waves striking Manhattan itself. And particularly, you know that the initial impact of these waves is, you know this from Japan, is destructive, but the wash, the recovery from the wave, can be equally damaging. So the notion was to build a wall against this. That is a kind of mitigating strategy to push the walls away. A very adaptive strategy was proposed about the edges surrounding Manhattan in rivers on either side to plant them very thickly with plants that could help disperse the wash back once the initial wave struck. It doesn't do anything to protect people in the first case by being hit by a wave, but it protects them from the sucking back thing. So it's a more adaptive strategy to this extremely to this violent pressure. These are two different. We're in 7 years ago in New York, very different strategies. The first, exposing people to the risk. The second, the adaptive strategy, exposing people to risk, but trying to modulate it. The first, attempting to put it away. I mention them because at the extremes today, we are looking for extreme forms of mitigation. That is, we are attempting to, in cities often, to build our way out of climate change through massive seawalls, through constructions which tidal movement, gates, and through regulations which take people off the highways. There are two problems with this. The first is that many of these enormous structures that are put in that mitigate climate change take a long time to build. In Rotterdam, for instance, the sea gates that keep out the tidal movements of the sea took 45 years to build. And Similarly, seawalls in New York City would take about 23 years to erect at a point where they could mitigate. And as with democracy, there's simply not enough time. There is another dimension of this which has a dimension of class, and that is that proposals to get people out of cars and to drive don't take account of the fact that poor people often live in settlements which are miles and miles away from where their work is. In Mexico City, for instance, the factories where very poor people work are typically located about an hour or 2 hours drive, 2 or even 3 hours drive from where the poor people on the western side of Mexico City live. So to take them out of cars would require that there be public transit, which could move masses of people. But you don't have that. There is no public transit that can service them. The same thing is true in Delhi. Here, China and South Korea have solved this problem somewhat by a reconfiguration of how factories themselves are operated so that they can be decentralized within the city. But that takes both a lot of capital and it takes an enormous amount of planning. In most of the emerging cities of the non-Western world, that is missing. So that to take people out of their cars, this pedestrian solution, is really a solution for the privileged, not for the unprivileged or underprivileged. And that is why we have to think about issues that don't seem immediately relevant to climate itself, like industrial organization, industrial location, in order to deal with this problem. Again, changing capitalism is not something you do at the stroke of a pen. So it's for that reason that I would like to see, both because people have the fantasy that they can build themselves out of climate change, and also because many of the solutions proposed are solutions for the privileged rather than the underprivileged, that I think we need to have more focus in the climate change era on adaptation, on ways of coping every day with something that we are not going to be able to prevent. That's a different kind of research. Some of the people in my shop are looking at what they call strategies of extreme adaptation in order to understand how a city can be made livable when the temperature rise is going to be so enormous, and the lack of water, electricity resources will be graver than it is now. It's a rather grim future, I know, but it's something that is a choice of being realistic, forms of adaptation, rather than dealing in Donald Trump-like fantasies that you can build yourself out of anything. I told you this is a personal talk. This is not anything official. So those are the three things I would like to say to you. That in looking at the social, economic, and political context of climate change in cities, there is a problem with migration. There is a problem with democratic practice. And there is a problem in getting the balance right between mitigation and adaptation. It would be silly for me to say to you that any one agency, and particularly a body as poor as the United Nations is, will be able to come up with a solution to these problems. But it's better to grapple with them openly than to assume that there is a technological fix. And this brings me to the final point, which I want to make to you, which is about smart cities, of which you, of course, have a very famous one in Songdo. I teach at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am a believer in high tech, but I do not believe that these problems can be solved with a high-tech technological fix. I'll give you an example of this. One of the simplest ways of dealing with heat in cities is to paint the roadways white. And we have developed materials, very low-tech materials, which allow us to, water-based materials inflected with titanium, which allow us to paint the massive surfaces in most cities which are black, which means that they absorb heat and hold it. Instead, paint them white so that they reflect heat back and that the cities can cool off. We've been experimenting with this in Los Angeles, and actually, if any of you have been to any Greek city, you've seen that all the houses are painted white. That's the way to do this, to repel heat. That's a low-tech solution. High-tech of the Songdo type smart cities are incredibly expensive. They are also very undemocratic. They avoid the problem of practice by simply regulating from a central computer how people should behave every day. And ultimately, that is politically not a sustainable way to live. People need agency. They need to be able to make choices. The communal issue that I talked to you about beforehand is one that expresses itself also in reactions to being regulated by technology. So I am, admirable as Songdo is, I am hoping that what we will find is low-tech rather than high-tech ways of dealing with the crisis that we face. That's particularly necessary for those places in Africa, Asia, Central Asia, and subcontinental Asia, and Latin America, which do not have access to the economic resources or the political will to spend vast amounts of money on what we know smart cities to be. So I wish you very well for your conference. I'm sorry that I'm in hospital rather than with you, but I hope to receive the proceedings and that your days will be good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
감사합니다.